Rachel Porter had been crouched behind a fallen pine for 20 minutes, camera raised and finger hovering over the shutter button, waiting for the elk to move back into frame where the afternoon light would catch the steam of its breath in the cold air. When her camera died without warning, the viewfinder going black in an instant that made her breath catch because batteries didn't just die like that. Not professional-grade lithium cells that she'd charged the night before and tested that. Morning. And when she pulled back to check the display, it was completely dead. No power indicator. No error message. No dying flicker of the screen, just nothing. She tried the backup battery from her pack and got the same result. Tried the third battery she kept for emergencies. Even tried the older battery from her first camera that she carried as a last resort, and every single one was completely drained. Absolute silence from equipment that had never failed her in 5 years of professional work. And it was in that moment of growing frustration that she noticed the forest had gone completely quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of animals being still, but the wrong kind of quiet where even the wind seemed to stop moving to the branches above her head. Where the creek she could usually hear bubbling 50 yards downslope had gone silent, where the ravens that had been calling to each other all morning had simply vanished. Her watch had stopped at 3:47 p.m., and she stared at it for a long moment before the unease really set in, before she started packing her gear with hands that wanted to shake, telling herself it was just a coincidence, even as every instinct she developed in 5 years of wilderness photography screamed that something was deeply wrong. The walk back to Pinewood Ridge took 15 minutes that felt like an hour, and with each step the silence pressed harder against her ears until she caught herself holding her breath just to hear something, anything. The sound of her own heartbeat becoming too loud in the absence of everything else. But there was nothing. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, no distant sound of the highway that should have been audible from the ridge trail. Not even the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. She came out of the tree line expecting to see the usual afternoon activity in town. Mothers picking up kids from school, people walking dogs or getting groceries or sitting on porches enjoying the last of the autumn warmth. But Main Street was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately define. Too still, too quiet, like a photograph instead of a living place. And then she realized she couldn't hear any cars running, couldn't hear the electrical hum that usually underlaid everything in a modern town, couldn't even hear voices or footsteps or the jingle of the bell above Peterson's market door. David Chen was standing outside his hardware store looking at his phone with the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. And when Rachel called out to him, he looked up with obvious relief that he wasn't alone in whatever was happening. His phone was dead too, completely unresponsive, and when she showed him her camera equipment, he just nodded and said his watch had stopped at 3:47. Same as hers. Same as the digital clock visible through his store window. And they stood there for a moment in the unnatural quiet before other people started emerging from buildings and houses, all of them with the same confused and frightened expressions, all of them holding dead phones or looking at stopped watches. Mrs. Patterson from the post office was crying quietly, saying she'd been on a call with her daughter in Seattle when everything just cut out, and old Mr. Vickers kept clicking his hearing aids on and off like the problem was with them and not with the complete absence of ambient sound. Rachel tried to stay calm, tried to think logically about what could cause a simultaneous failure of all electronic devices and all ambient noise, but nothing in her experience accounted for this. Nothing she'd ever read or heard about matched the wrongness of what was happening. The sound of an engine made everyone's head snap around at once. The normal noise of a truck motor suddenly precious in the silence, and James Kovac's pickup came racing down Main Street going way too fast, fishtailing slightly as he hit the brakes and nearly crashed into a parked car before jumping out and starting to talk too fast, the words tumbling over each other about shapes in the fog near the mountain pass, things that moved wrong, shadows that didn't match any animal he knew, and the way they seemed to watch him as he drove past. He was pale and shaking, and his truck was still running, the only vehicle anyone could see or hear that still had power. And David asked him if his phone worked, but James just shook his head and said everything died when he was up near the pass, his phone, his GPS. Even the radio cut into static and then silence. The church bell started to ring then, the familiar sound of it marking the hour, and everyone turned toward the white steeple visible above the buildings. But after 3 rings it just stopped, not the natural in a sequence, but sudden cut-off mid-swing that left the last tone hanging in the air. James was still trying to explain what he'd seen when his truck's engine coughed once and died. Just like that, all the sound and power cutting out as if someone had flipped a switch, and the expression on his face shifted from fear to something closer to horror. People started gathering near the church, where Pastor Jerome was trying to organize everyone, his deep voice calling for calm and prayer, but the panic was spreading faster than his reassurances could contain it. People pulling out phones that wouldn't turn on, trying car ignitions that wouldn't catch. One man attempting to start a battery-powered radio that should have worked regardless of what happened to the power grid, but remained stubbornly silent. Rachel found herself looking toward the mountains without quite knowing why. And that's when she saw it, the fog rolling down from the peaks like something alive, thick and gray and moving with purpose rather than with any wind. And she thought about what James had said about shapes that move wrong. David suddenly grabbed her arm and asked if she'd seen Lily, his 16-year-old daughter, who should have been home from school by now. And the way his voice cracked on her name made Rachel's chest tighten, because in all the confusion she'd almost forgotten that this wasn't just equipment failure. This was everyone, every form of communication, every way people had to reach each other or call for help. They ran toward David's house 3 blocks away, leaving the growing crowd at the church, and found Lily sitting on the porch with her laptop open and her phone in pieces on the step beside her, looking up at them with eyes too old for her face, and saying she'd tried everything, every device in the house, even the old ham radio David's father had left in the basement, and there was nothing, no signals, no power, no explanation. The fog was closer now. Rachel could see it between buildings, that same unnatural thickness that didn't dissipate or thin at the edges but held together like something solid. And when she mentioned it, David's face went grim, and he said Sara Whitmore's house was the best option, up on a hill with a stove and a well, old enough to function without electricity. They headed back to find James and Pastor Jerome, and anyone else who would listen. Rachel carrying her useless camera bag out of habit, and found a scene of barely controlled chaos as people argued about whether to stay or try to drive out, even though every car they tried wouldn't start, every key turned in dead ignitions. David's voice cut through the arguments, steady and practical, explaining about Sarah's house and how they needed shelter before dark, how the fog was coming and none of them understood what was happening, but staying together seemed smarter than scattering. And maybe it was a calm certainty in his voice, or maybe it was the fact that the fog was now visible at the end of Main Street. But people started to nod, started to agree. The group that formed was smaller than Rachel expected. Just her and David and Lily. James Kovac still pale and jumpy. Pastor Jerome insisting his place was with his flock, and a handful of others who peeled off in different directions as they walked, heading for their own homes or their own plans. And Rachel wanted to call after them that staying together was safer, but she had no evidence for that. No reason beyond instinct to think the fog was something to fear rather than just an unusual weather pattern. They saw Mrs. Patterson trying to start her sedan, saw the Hendersons loading their kids into a minivan that wouldn't turn over, saw at least a dozen people making choices that scattered them across town, and Rachel felt the weight of knowing they might not see any of these people again, even as she told herself she was being paranoid. Sara Whitmore's house sat at the top of Maple Street, an old Victorian that had been in her family for generations. And when they climbed the porch steps, Sara opened the door before they could knock, looking at them with an expression that was far too calm, too unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting this. She welcomed them in without questions, gesturing to the living room where a fire was already burning in the old stone fireplace. And when David asked if Tom was home, Sarah's face didn't change at all, as she said he'd gone down to check the basement a few hours ago, and she was sure he'd be up soon. But something in a way, she said, it made Rachel's skin crawl. The fog pressed against the windows now, so thick they couldn't see the street anymore, couldn't see anything beyond the gray wall that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and Lily stood close to the glass with her phone in her hand. still trying to get a signal from something that felt increasingly irrelevant. Pastor Jerome suggested they pray, and Sara just nodded, lighting candles around the room with steady hands, while David and James started looking at the doors and windows like they were thinking about barricades, and Rachel found herself unable to look away from the fog, from the way it seemed to watch them back. Night was coming fast, faster than it should, the light dying too quickly, even accounting for the thick cloud cover, and Sara moved through the house, closing curtains and shutters with practiced efficiency, while explaining where the food was stored, where the water was, where the firewood was stacked, all of it delivered in the same eerily calm tone that suggested she'd done this before. Rachel wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to demand answers about the look in her eyes and the way she kept glancing at the basement door, but before she could form the words, they all heard it, a sound from below their feet, something moving in the darkness under the house, something that made a sound like breathing, slow and deliberate and wrong, and Sara just smiled that terrible calm smile and said they should probably stay upstairs tonight, and Rachel realized with clarity that felt like ice water that whatever was happening to Pinewood Ridge, Sara Whitmore had been waiting for it, had maybe been waiting for a very long time. The first thing David did was start moving furniture, dragging the heavy oak dining table across the floor to block the front door, while James worked on the back entrance, both of them moving with the kind of focused intensity that came from needing to do something, anything, to feel less helpless in a situation that made no sense, their footsteps loud in the oppressive silence that had settled over the house like a physical weight. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by every electronic device she could find in Sara's house. Her phone disassembled into component parts spread out on a towel. David's phone connected to a portable charger that should have worked but didn't. An old transistor radio from the 1970s that her grandfather had sworn would survive anything including nuclear war. And all that was dead, completely unresponsive, like the fundamental laws of electricity, had simply stopped applying within the boundaries of Pinewood Ridge. Rachel watched her work with methodical precision, testing each device multiple ways, swapping batteries and cables and power sources, taking notes in a small notebook with handwriting that got tighter and more control with each failure, documenting everything with the desperate hope that if she could just understand the pattern, she could find a way to break it. And she recognized the look on the girl's face because she'd seen it in the mirror often enough, that need to understand, to find the pattern, to make sense of chaos through careful observation and rational analysis, even when everything about the situation defied rationality. Pastor Jerome had settled into an armchair near the fireplace and was praying quietly, his deep voice a constant murmur that might have been comforting if it didn't keep hitching on certain words like he was trying to convince himself as much as God, repeating phrases about protection and deliverance with increasing desperation. And Sara moved around them all like a ghost, her slippered feet making no sound on the hardwood floors, checking the fire, bringing out blankets and pillows from upstairs closets, laying food on the kitchen table with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing before, who knew the routine of preparing for a siege, even if she wouldn't explain how or why. The smell from the basement had gotten worse, something sweet and wrong that made Rachel's stomach turn. And finally David stopped pretending they could ignore it and said someone needed to go down and check, his eyes finding James, because they both knew what they were going to find, even if neither wanted to say it out loud. Rachel followed them down the narrow wooden stairs, her hand trailing along the wall, because Sara's flashlight barely pushed back the darkness. At the bottom of the steps, Tom Whitmore lay sprawled like he'd fallen, his eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling, his skin waxy and cold. When David checked for a pulse they all knew wouldn't be there. There was no blood, no visible injury, nothing that explained why a healthy 60-year-old man who'd gone down to check the circuit breaker was now dead at the bottom of his basement stairs. And when Sara appeared behind them with a candle, Rachel expected tears or shock or something human. But the old woman just looked down at her husband of 40 years and said in that same flat, calm voice, "He's been taken," like she was commenting on the weather. James asked what she meant by taken, and Sara turned those empty eyes on him and said, "It's still in the house. We need to be careful." And then she walked back upstairs like the conversation was over, leaving the three of them standing in the dark with a corpse and more questions and answers. They carried Tom up between them, David taking the shoulders and James the feet, Rachel lighting the way with a candle that kept threatening to go out in draft that had no source. And they lay him in the spare bedroom and covered it with a sheet. And the whole time Rachel kept thinking about Sara's face, about the absolute lack of surprise, like she'd been expecting to find her husband dead. Back in the living room, they compared notes in low voices, while Sara stared into fire, and Lily tested another useless device. And the picture that emerged was impossible but consistent. James described how his equipment had died at 3:47 p.m., exactly when he'd been driving past the old logging road that led up into mountains, how he'd seen shapes in the fog that moved against the wind, shadows that seemed to watch him with something like intelligence. Rachel's camera had died at the same moment, 3:47 exactly, and David's watch had stopped then too, and Lily pulled out her notebook to show them her timeline. Internet had dropped at 3:45, cell service at 3:46, power grid at 3:47, like whatever was happening had spread in waves from somewhere up in the mountains. Sara spoke without turning from the fire, her voice carrying clearly in the silent house, and said Tom had gone to the basement at 3:45 because he'd heard something down there, something that sounded like their old dog scratching at the door, except their dog had been dead for 3 years. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, noticeably, enough that Rachel could see her breath, and it wasn't coming from the windows or the door, but from the corner near the hallway, a cold spot that seemed to pulse like something breathing. They heard it then, all of them at once, a sound in the walls like something moving between studs, a sliding, scraping sound that traveled from the basement up to the first floor and into the ceiling above their heads. And Lily grabbed her father's arm hard enough to leave marks. James wanted to leave right then, so they should make a run for the highway while they still could, his voice getting louder and higher as he argued that staying in a house with a dead body and things in the walls was insane. But David cut him off and asked where exactly he planned to run in fog, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, in the dark, with no working phones or cars, or anywhere to call for help if something went wrong. Rachel found herself mediating between them, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking, suggesting they wait until morning when they could at least see where they were going, when they could make a rational decision based on daylight and visibility instead of panic and fear. Pastor Jerome stopped praying long enough to say this was a test of faith, that God was watching to see who would break and who would stand firm. And Sara laughed, actually laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made everyone turn to stare at her. She said faith had nothing to do with it, that this had happened before and would happen again, that the only thing that mattered was staying inside and staying quiet and not answering when they called. And when David asked who they were, she just shook her head and said he'd find out soon enough. Lily had moved to the window, her notebook forgotten, staring out at the fog that pressed against the glass like something solid, and she said softly that she thought she saw faces in it, shapes that might have been human or might have been something else. And Rachel looked and saw nothing but gray, but the way the fog moved did seem purposeful, seemed to pulse and swirl with intention rather than random air currents. They rationed out the food Sara had set out, canned soup heated on the wood stove, bread that was already starting to go stale even though it had been fresh that morning, water from bottles because no one wanted to drink from the taps after what had happened to Tom, and the meal was silent except for the sounds of eating and the occasional crack from the fire and the constant, nerve-shredding sound of something moving in the walls. Rachel tried to remember what she knew about survival situations, about keeping people calm and focused, about the importance of routine and normalcy in crisis. But there was nothing normal about shadows that moved wrong or fog that watched or the way Sara Whitmore kept glancing at the basement door like she expected something come through it. Around midnight, when the fire had burned down the coals and everyone was trying to rest despite knowing sleep was impossible, the knocking started. 3 heavy blows on the front door, each one perfectly spaced, perfectly measured, and then silence. And then 3 more knocks with exactly the same rhythm, the same force, the same terrible patience. Everyone froze, David's hand on the poker he grabbed from the fireplace. James halfway to his feet, Lily pressed against her father's side, and they waited in the silence that followed for something, anything, to explain the sound. Then they heard the voice, Tom Whitmore's voice, perfect and familiar and absolutely wrong, calling through the door. "Sara? Why is the door locked? Let me in, it's cold out here." Sarah's face went even paler than before, and she whispered, "That's not Tom. Don't answer it. Don't make a sound." But the voice kept calling, kept asking in that reasonable, slightly hurt tone why his wife had locked him out of his own house, why she was making him stand in the cold. And Rachel felt her throat close up, because it sounded exactly like a confused elderly man who couldn't understand why he wasn't being let inside. The knocking came again, 3 measured blows, and the voice changed tactics, became worried instead of hurt, said he'd been looking for them for hours, that everyone else in town was gone, and he'd been so scared, that he just wanted to come inside and be safe with his wife. And James actually moved toward the door before David grabbed him and held him back. Pastor Jerome started praying louder, his voice shaking, and the thing outside mimicked him, repeated his words in Tom's voice, turning prayer into mockery, and then it started on Lily, calling her name in Tom's gentle grandfather voice, asking why she wouldn't help an old man who'd always been kind to her, who'd given her candy and fixed her bicycle and taught her to fish. Lily was crying silently, her face buried in her father's chest, and David's jaw was clenched so tight Rachel could see the muscles jumping in his cheek, but they didn't answer, didn't acknowledge the voice, just sat in the firelight and listened to it cycle through different approaches, different emotional appeals, sometimes angry, sometimes sad, sometimes confused, always perfectly human, always perfectly wrong. The night stretched out like something elastic, every minute feeling like an hour, and the voice never stopped, never gave up, just kept trying different methods to get them to respond, to acknowledge it, to open the door, and Rachel realized with creeping horror that it was learning, adjusting its tactics based on their reactions. And she wondered how long they could hold out against something that had infinite patience and an ever-growing understanding of how to hurt them. Dawn came slowly, the gray light barely distinguishable from the darkness, and the fog hadn't lifted at all. If anything, it was thicker, pressing against the windows so hard it seemed like the glass should crack from the pressure, and the voice finally stopped, but the silence it left behind was somehow worse, filled with anticipation, with a certainty that this was just a beginning, that whatever had taken Tom and killed all their technology and trapped them in this house with an old woman who knew more than she was telling. It wasn't done with them yet, not even close. The first thing David did was start moving furniture, dragging the heavy oak dining table across the floor to block the front door, while James worked on the back entrance, both of them moving with the kind of focused intensity that came from needing to do something, anything, to feel less helpless in a situation that made no sense, their footsteps loud in oppressive silence that had settled over the house like a physical weight. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by every electronic device she could find in Sarah's house. Her phone disassembled into component parts spread out on a towel. David's phone connected to a portable charger that should have worked but didn't. An old transistor radio from the 1970s that her grandfather had sworn would survive anything including nuclear war. And all that was dead, completely unresponsive, like the fundamental laws of electricity, had simply stopped applying within the boundaries of Pinewood Ridge. Rachel watched her work with methodical precision, testing each device multiple ways, swapping batteries and cables and power sources, taking notes in a small notebook with handwriting that got tighter and more controlled with each failure, documenting everything with the desperate hope that if she could just understand the pattern, she could find a way to break it. And she recognized the look on the girl's face because she'd seen it in the mirror often enough, that need to understand, to find the pattern, to make sense of chaos through careful observation and rational analysis, even when everything about the situation defied rationality. Pastor Jerome had settled into an armchair near the fireplace and was praying quietly, his deep voice a constant murmur that might have been comforting if it didn't keep hitching on certain words like he was trying to convince himself as much as God, repeating phrases about protection and deliverance with increasing desperation. And Sara moved around them all like a ghost, her slippered feet making no sound on the hardwood floors, checking the fire, bringing out blankets and pillows from upstairs closets, laying food on the kitchen table with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing before, who knew the routine of preparing for a siege even if she wouldn't explain how or why. The smell from the basement had gotten worse, something sweet and wrong that made Rachel's stomach turn, and finally David stopped pretending they could ignore it and said someone needed to go down and check, his eyes finding James because they both knew what they were going to find even if neither wanted to say out loud. Rachel followed them down the narrow wooden stairs, her hand trailing along the wall because Sarah's flashlight barely pushed back the darkness. At the bottom of the steps, Tom Whitmore lay sprawled like he'd fallen, his eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling, his skin waxy and cold. When David checked for a pulse they all knew wouldn't be there. There was no blood, no visible injury, nothing that explained why a healthy 60-year-old man who'd gone down to check the circuit breaker was now dead at the bottom of his basement stairs. And when Sara appeared behind them with a candle, Rachel expected tears or shock or something human. But the old woman just looked down at her husband of 40 years and said in that same flat, calm voice, "He's been taken," like she was commenting on the weather. James asked what she meant by taken, and Sara turned those empty eyes on him and said, "It's still in the house. We need to be careful." And then she walked back upstairs like the conversation was over, leaving the three of them standing in the dark with a corpse and more questions than answers. They carried Tom up between them, David taking the shoulders and James the feet, Rachel lighting the way with a candle that kept threatening to go out in drafts that had no source. And they laid him in the spare bedroom and covered it with a sheet. And the whole time Rachel kept thinking about Sarah's face, about the absolute lack of surprise, like she'd been expecting to find her husband dead. Back in the living room, they compared notes in low voices while Sara stared into the fire and Lily tested another useless device. And the picture that emerged was impossible but consistent. James described how his equipment had died at 3:47 p.m., exactly when he'd been driving past the old logging road that led up into mountains, how he'd seen shapes in the fog that moved against the wind, shadows that seemed to watch him with something like intelligence. Rachel's camera had died at the same moment, 3:47 exactly, and David's watch had stopped then too, and Lily pulled out her notebook to show them her timeline. Internet had dropped at 3:45, cell service at 3:46, power grid at 3:47, like whatever was happening had spread in waves from somewhere up in the mountains. Sara spoke without turning from the fire, her voice carrying clearly in the silent house, and said Tom had gone to the basement at 3:45 because he'd heard something down there, something that sounded like their old dog scratching at the door, except their dog had been dead for 3 years. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, noticeably, enough that Rachel could see her breath, and it wasn't coming from the windows or the door, but from a corner near the hallway, a cold spot that seemed to pulse like something breathing. They heard it then, all of them at once. A sound in the walls like something moving between the studs, a sliding, scraping sound that traveled from the basement up to the first floor and into the ceiling above their heads. And Lily grabbed her father's arm hard enough to leave marks. James wanted to leave right then, said they should make a run for the highway while they still could, his voice getting louder and higher as he argued that staying in a house with a dead body and things in the walls was insane. But David cut him off and asked where exactly he planned to run in fog, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, in the dark, with no working phones or cars or any way to call for help if something went wrong. Rachel found herself mediating between them, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking, suggesting they wait until morning when they could at least see where they were going, when they could make a rational decision based on daylight and visibility instead of panic and fear. Pastor Jerome stopped praying long enough to say this was a test of faith, that God was watching to see who would break and who would stand firm. And Sara laughed, actually laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made everyone turn to stare at her. She said faith had nothing to do with it, that this had happened before and would happen again, that the only thing that mattered was staying inside and staying quiet and not answering when they called. And when David asked who they were, she just shook her head and said he'd find out soon enough. Lily had moved a window, her notebook forgotten, staring out at the fog that pressed against the glass like something solid, and she said softly that she thought she saw faces in it, shapes that might have been human or might have been something else. And Rachel looked and saw nothing but gray, but the way the fog moved did seem purposeful, seemed to pulse and swirl with intention rather than random air currents. They rationed out the food Sara had set out, canned soup heated on the wood stove, bread that was already starting to go stale even though it had been fresh that morning, water from bottles because no one wanted to drink from the taps after what had happened to Tom, and the meal was silent except for the sound of eating and the occasional crack from the fire and the constant, nerve-shredding sound of something moving in the walls. Rachel tried to remember what she knew about survival situations, about keeping people calm and focused, about the importance of routine and normalcy in crisis. But there was nothing normal about shadows that moved wrong or fog that watched, or the way Sara Whitmore kept glancing at the basement door like she expected someone come through it. Around midnight, when the fire had burned down the coals and everyone was trying to rest despite knowing sleep was impossible, the knocking started. 3 heavy blows on the front door, each one perfectly spaced, perfectly measured, and then silence. And then 3 more knocks with exactly the same rhythm, the same force, the same terrible patience. Everyone froze, David's hand on the poker he grabbed from the fireplace, James halfway to his feet, Lily pressed against her father's side, and they waited in the silence that followed for something, anything, to explain the sound. Then they heard the voice, Tom Whitmore's voice, perfect and familiar and absolutely wrong, calling through the door. "Sara, why is the door locked? Let me in, it's cold out here." Sarah's face went even paler than before, and she whispered, "That's not Tom. Don't answer it. Don't make a sound." But the voice kept calling, kept asking in that reasonable, slightly hurt tone why his wife had locked him out of his own house, why she was making him stand in the cold. And Rachel felt her throat close up because it sounded exactly like a confused elderly man who couldn't understand why he wasn't being let inside. The knocking came again, 3 measured blows, and the voice changed tactics, became worried instead of hurt, said he'd been looking for them for hours, that everyone else in town was gone and he'd been so scared, that he just wanted to come inside and be safe with his wife. And James actually moved toward the door before David grabbed him and held him back. Pastor Jerome started praying louder, his voice shaking, and the thing outside mimicked him, repeated his words in Tom's voice, turning prayer into mockery. And then it started on Lily, calling her name in Tom's gentle grandfather voice, asking why she wouldn't help an old man who'd always been kind to her, who'd given her candy and fixed her bicycle and taught her to fish. Lily was crying silently, her face buried in her father's chest, and David's jaw was clenched so tight Rachel could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. But they didn't answer, didn't acknowledge the voice, just sat in the firelight and listened to it cycle through different approaches, different emotional appeals, sometimes angry, sometimes sad, sometimes confused, always perfectly human, always perfectly wrong. The night stretched out like something elastic, every minute feeling like an hour, and the voice never stopped, never gave up, just kept trying different methods to get them to respond, to acknowledge it, to open the door. And Rachel realized with creeping horror that it was learning, adjusting its tactics based on their reactions. And she wondered how long they could hold out against something that had infinite patience and an ever-growing understanding of how to hurt them. Dawn came slowly, the gray light barely distinguishable from the darkness, and the fog hadn't lifted at all. If anything, it was thicker, pressing against the window so hard it seemed like the glass should crack from the pressure. And the voice finally stopped, but the silence it left behind was somehow worse, filled with anticipation, with the certainty that this was just the beginning, that whatever had taken Tom and killed all their technology and trapped them in this house with an old woman who knew more than she was telling, It wasn't done with him yet, not even close. The third day began with Pastor Jerome's breakdown, his careful composure finally shattering like glass under pressure as he stood in the center of the living room screaming about divine punishment and the sins of Pinewood Ridge, his voice rising to a fevered pitch as he ranted about Judgment Day and how they were all being tested, how only the pure would survive and the rest would be taken by the darkness that fed on wickedness and corruption and the secret evils that people hid in their hearts. David tried to calm him down, speaking in low, reasonable tones, approaching him slowly with hands outstretched like he was dealing with a wild animal. But Jerome was beyond reason now, beyond anything human, his eyes wild and unfocused, and seeing things that weren't there, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold, as he grabbed Lily by the shoulders and shook her hard enough to make her teeth click together, saying children were innocent. Children could still be saved if they left now, if they walked out into the fog with faith in their hearts. God would protect them. God would make a path through the darkness for the pure of heart, and David had to physically tear him away from his daughter with enough force to leave bruises on both of them, slamming the pastor against the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of him and crack the plaster. Jerome recovered quickly, though, driven by whatever had broken inside his mind, by voices only he could hear or visions only he could see. And he ran to the nearest window and smashed it with his fist, ignoring the blood streaming from his knuckles and the glass embedded in his skin as he tried to climb to the broken frame, babbling about needing to reach the church, needing to save his flock, needing to fulfill his sacred duty, even if it killed him. And they watched in horror as something in the fog reached back to the window, a shape that might have been an arm or a tentacle or something else entirely, gray and flowing and wrong, semi-solid like smoke given form, and it grabbed Jerome by the hair and dragged him to the window so fast he didn't even have time to scream more than once, his body jerking like a puppet as it disappeared into the churning gray. They could hear him for a while after, his voice receding into the distance as he prayed at the top of his lungs, the words growing fainter and more desperate and increasingly incoherent until they cut off mid-sentence with a wet sound that made Lily clap her hands over her ears. And then there was just the wind moving through the broken window, and the cold pouring in, and the smell of something organic and rotting until David managed to board it up with pieces of furniture and spare wood from Sarah's garage, hammering nails with shaking hands. The group was down to 4 now. Rachel and David and Lily and Sara, and the house seemed to know it, seemed to sense their dwindling numbers and press harder against them. The walls closing in imperceptibly like the house was slowly contracting around them, the geometry becoming more aggressively wrong with hallways that twisted back on themselves in impossible loops and stairs that led to rooms that shouldn't exist, doors that open onto blank walls or infinite darkness, or sometimes onto the same room you just left, but subtly different, subtly wrong. The cold spots weren't just following them anymore. They were everywhere, competing pools of frigid air that made their breath steam and their fingers numb even when they stood next to fire. And the shadows await now, actual physical substance that Rachel felt brush against her when she walked through doorways, like passing through cobwebs, except these cobwebs pushed back, resisted, sometimes even seemed to grab at her clothes or hair before letting go. They heard their own voices constantly, coming from every empty room, sometimes having conversations they did hours ago, sometimes saying things they'd never said, and worst of all, sometimes saying things they'd only thought, private fears and doubts spoken aloud in their own voices by something that shouldn't know what was in their heads. David found the boxes in Sarah's attic when he went looking for more blankets, old cardboard boxes that had been sealed with tape and stacked in a corner for decades. And when he opened them, newspapers and journals and photographs spilled across the dusty floor in a cascade of yellowed paper and fading ink. And he called Rachel up to look because what he found changed everything, explained everything, made their situation both better and infinitely worse because now they understood what they were fighting. There were newspaper clippings dating back to 1952, yellowed and brittle enough that they crackled when touched, with headlines about 12 people vanishing during an unseasonable winter storm that had appeared without warning. Witnesses reporting strange fog that seemed to move with purpose, and the complete failure of all communications, including telegraph lines that had been cut by no human hand. Search parties finding an empty town days later with doors standing open and meals left half. Eaten on tables and no sign of violence or struggle, just absence. More articles from 1978. 8 people disappeared this time. A 5-day fog that isolated Pinewood Ridge from the outside world completely, cutting it off from radio and telephone, and even carrier pigeons that people had tried to send out in desperation. Survivors reporting voices in the darkness, calling their names and shapes that moved wrong in the peripheral vision. But the official report called it mass hysteria and carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heating systems, because the alternative was admitting something impossible. There was a journal from 1991, written in shaking handwriting that got progressively worse with each entry, the letters becoming larger and more erratic, describing a family barricading themselves in this very house, in Sarah's house, watching neighbors taken one by some in the fog until they were alone, until the fog pressed so hard against the windows they thought the glass would shatter from pressure, and the entry stopped on day 6 with a simple line. It's inside now. It's wearing Father's face. God help us all. David found photographs too, old black and white images of the town, and in several of them you could see it if you looked closely, a wrongness in the background, shapes in windows that didn't quite resolve into anything human, shadows on the mountain that suggested something massive watching the valley below. Sara finally spoke when they brought the evidence downstairs, her voice stronger than it had been in days, and she told them everything she'd been holding back. She and Tom had been children in 1978, had survived by hiding in this house with her grandmother who knew the old stories, the warnings that had been passed down from the indigenous people who'd lived here long before white settlers arrived. Her grandmother said the mountain was hollow, not literally but spiritually, a thin place where the barrier between worlds was permeable, and something ancient lived in that hollowness, something that existed in the spaces between things, in silence and absence and the terrible loneliness of absolute isolation. It fed on connection, or rather on the severing of connection, drawing strength from the moment when people reached out for help and found nothing, when they called into the void and heard only echoes of their own desperation. The fog was how it manifested in the physical world, a visible expression of its nature, thick and impenetrable and suffocating, cutting people off from each other, from technology, from any form of communication or comfort, until they were so desperate for contact that they'd accept anything, even the false voices calling from the darkness. Her grandmother had survived by refusing to answer, by staying connected to the other survivors in the house through constant physical contact and conversation, by never letting the silence win. And Sara and Tom had done the same, huddling together for 5 days until fog finally receded. But Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper when she admitted that she and Tom hadn't really survived, not entirely, that something had touched them in the darkness and left a mark, a connection that never fully severed. And when the fog came back this time, she'd known immediately, had felt it waking up in the mountain like an old friend calling her home. Tom had heard it first, she said, had gone to the basement because the voice was loudest there, and when she found him dead, she knew he'd answered, knew he'd let it in, and now he was part of it, his voice and his memories and his shape, all tools it could use to hunt the rest of them. Lily had been documenting everything in her notebook, and she showed him the patterns she'd found. The knocking always came in threes. The voices cycled to the same emotional beats in the same order. The fog pulsed with rhythm that matched a heartbeat if you tracked it over hours. And there were gaps in the pattern, moments of silence that suggested it needed to rest or recharge, or maybe just think about its next move. She said it was learning from them, adapting its tactics, using their own psychology against them. And every time they resisted, it got smarter, got better at finding their weaknesses. They ventured to the basement together, all 4 of them, because no one wanted to be alone anymore, and found the symbols carved into the walls that Sarah's grandmother had tried to paint over, geometric shapes and spirals that hurt to look at directly, like they existed in too many dimensions for human eyes to process comfortably. Rachel recognized some of them from her research on local indigenous history, boundary markers and warnings, representations of concepts that didn't translate cleanly into English, things about forbidden ground and sleeping gods, and the price of disturbing what should be left alone. Sara said her ancestors had known about the symbols when they bought the land, had been told explicitly not to build here, but land was cheap, and they were poor and desperate, and they'd built anyway, and every 13 to 15 years the mountain reminded them of their mistake. The voices outside had been continuous since Pastor Jerome's death, a cacophony of Tom and James and Jerome and strangers and their own voices all calling at once, overlapping and echoing and sometimes harmonizing in ways that couldn't be accidental. And Rachel realized it was trying to overwhelm them with noise, to make them so desperate for silence that they'd do anything to make it stop, even open the door. David asked Sara how her grandmother had survived when so many others hadn't, what the secret was. And Sara said there was no secret, just stubbornness and luck and the willingness to endure. But her grandmother had also said that each time the fog came, it was stronger, learned from past failures, adapted to overcome whatever had stopped it before. And she predicted that eventually no one would survive, that the fog would learn enough to take everyone, and the town would be empty forever. Night was falling again, the third night, and the house was barely recognizable as the place they'd entered 2 days ago. Walls that breathed, floors that shifted underfoot, reflections and mirrors that moved independently of their sources. And through it all, the constant pressure being watched by something vast and patient and hungry, something that had all the time in the world to wear them down until they broke. And as the darkness closed and Rachel looked at the other 3 survivors and wondered which of them would be next to hear their name called in a voice they couldn't resist. The 4th day began in confusion because none of them could agree what time it was, or even if it was actually the 4th day. The clocks in the house all showing different times. Some stopped at random moments, some running backward through yesterday, some spinning wildly through hours that hadn't happened yet and might never happen. And their internal sense of time had become so distorted by a lack of sleep and constant fear that David insisted was morning while Rachel was certain they'd only been asleep for an hour at most, and Lily's careful notes showed gaps and overlaps that made no sense. Entire hours missing from the timeline or repeated or happening in the wrong order, like someone had shuffled the pages of reality. The house was barely recognizable now. Rooms connecting in ways that violated every law of physics. The bathroom door opening onto the attic. The kitchen leading directly to the basement without any stairs between. Hallways that looped back on themselves or stretched impossibly long, or sometimes just ended in solid walls that hadn't been there yesterday. Sara was fading, literally becoming translucent like she was made of glass or water, and when Rachel looked at her in certain lights, she could see through the old woman to the wall behind her, could see the outline of her bones and organs like an X-ray, could see her heart still beating even though it shouldn't be beating at all, and Sara's voice when she spoke was distant and echoing like it was coming from somewhere far away, from the bottom of a well, or from another dimension entirely. She told him in that fading voice that she'd held on as long as she could, longer than she should have been able to, that she died in 1978, when she was just 16 years old, that the thing in the fog had taken her on the 3rd night, when she'd gone to get water from the kitchen, and something had touched her in the dark hallway, something cold and vast and wrong, and pulled something essential out of her, left her body walking around but empty inside, a shell with no soul. Her grandmothers will have been strong enough to keep Sara's echo anchored to house, to this place, so she could hope the next time the fog came, and she'd waited 47 years as a ghost pretending to be alive, marrying Tom who never knew his wife was dead, living a half-life in the spaces between reality and whatever existed in the fog. She explained what she learned in all those decades of waiting and watching. The fog came from something ancient in the mountain, something that had existed before human concepts of life and death had any meaning, something that lived in the spaces between connection and isolation, that fed on the moment when someone reached out for help and found only silence, when they called into the void and the void didn't answer back. The communication blackout wasn't a side effect of its presence. It was a point, the whole purpose, creating absolute isolation so that when people finally heard a voice calling to them, they were so desperate for contact, they didn't question whether it was real. Sara's form flickered like a candle flame as she told them the only way to survive was to wait it out, to refuse the voices no matter how convincing they became, to stay connected to each other through constant physical touch and conversation. So the isolation never became complete, but she admitted that this time felt different, stronger, like it learned from every previous cycle and adapted, and she wasn't sure her grandmother's protection would hold much longer. She faded completely mid-sentence, her last words a warning that it knew they were there, knew they were strong, knew they'd resisted longer than most, and it wouldn't stop until they broke or got bored. And then she was gone, just empty air where an old woman had been sitting. And Rachel felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees as whatever had been holding the house together through Sara's will finally gave way. The house erupted in activity the moment Sara vanished, footsteps running through every room at once, doors slamming in rapid sequence like dominoes falling, voices everywhere calling their names, Tom and James and Pastor Jerome, and Sara herself and strangers, and their own voices, and voices they'd never heard before, all screaming and begging and threatening and crying in cacophony that made thought impossible. They huddled together in the living room, Rachel and David and Lily pressed so close they could feel each other's heartbeats, and the voices outside bled to the walls and mixed with voices inside until they couldn't tell what was real anymore, couldn't distinguish between the sound of their own breathing and something breathing next to them in the darkness. Lily was the one who put together, her hands shaking as she showed them her notebook filled with calculations and observations, explaining in a voice that kept breaking that the fog wasn't just blocking communications. It was creating a perfect void, a space where human connection couldn't exist, and in that void the only voices left were the ones it provided, and eventually, inevitably, people reached for those voices because the human mind couldn't survive complete isolation. It would accept any connection rather than none at all, even connections that would destroy it. Rachel's camera, the one that had died on that first day in the woods, was still in her bag where she left it gathering dust, and she remembered suddenly that she'd been taking pictures right up until the moment it failed, that the last shots might have captured something important, something that would help them understand what they were fighting. They tore the house apart looking for batteries, any batteries that might still have a charge, rifling through drawers and cabinets and old boxes, finding nothing in drawer after drawer but dead cells and empty packages, until Lily discovered a pack of old AAs in the back of Sara's junk drawer, still sealed in plastic from 1995, untouched for 3 decades. And when Rachel loaded them into the camera, with shaking hands, it powered on for maybe 30 seconds before the batteries drained, the power indicator dropping from full to empty in the span of heartbeats, but 30 seconds was enough. The photos loaded one by one on the small LCD screen, images of the forest, the elk she'd been photographing, the trees, and then the last 3 shots taken at 3:46 p.m. showed the fog rolling in. And when Rachel zoomed in on the digital display, she felt her stomach drop, because the fog wasn't empty. It was full, packed with faces, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, translucent and overlapping and stacked on top of each other like layers of tracing paper. All of them watching the camera, watching her, frozen in expressions of terror, or longing, or hunger, or all 3 at once. Some of the faces she recognized, people from town, people who disappeared in previous cycles, people from the newspaper articles, and she realized with horror that everyone the fog had ever taken was still in there, still conscious, still aware, trapped in whatever space existed between the physical world and wherever the ancient thing actually lived. The camera died permanently then, the batteries completely drained, but the image was burned into Rachel's mind. All those faces watching, all those people who'd answer when the voices called. And she understood finally that there was no rescue coming, no solution, no way to fight something that existed partially outside reality and had infinite patience and an ever-growing army of voices it could use. David had been staring at nothing for the last hour, his eyes unfocused and seeing things that weren't there, and Rachel realized he was listening to something only he could hear. Some voice calling from a frequency the rest of them couldn't access. And when she touched his arm to get his attention, he jerked like he'd been shocked and looked at her with eyes that didn't quite focus, didn't quite see her. He said in a flat, emotionless voice that he could hear his ex-wife, Lily's mother who died in childbirth 16 years ago, bleeding out on a hospital table while doctors tried desperately to save her, and she was telling him things only she would know. Intimate details from their life together, memories from their wedding night, the name they'd chosen for Lily before she was born, the exact words she'd said when she knew she was dying, and wanted to promise he'd take care of their daughter. And she was begging him to come to her, saying she'd been waiting so long in the cold and the dark, saying Lily needed both her parents, and he just had to open the door, and they could be a family again, all three of them together like they were always meant to be. Lily grabbed her father's face with both hands and forced him to look at her, to see her, screaming that it wasn't real, that her mother was dead and gone and had been for 16 years, that whatever was out there was just using her voice like a puppet. But David's eyes were distant and glassy, and Rachel wasn't sure he could hear his daughter over the voice calling from the fog, over the siren song of reunion with someone he'd loved and lost. Then they heard it, all of them at once, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Lily's voice calling from outside, even though Lily was standing right there between them with her hands on her father's face. And the outside Lily was crying and saying she was scared, saying she'd gotten separated somehow and couldn't find a way back to the fog, begging her father to help her, to come out and bring her home to safety. David's hand went to the door handle and Rachel grabbed him, wrapped her arms around him and held on with every ounce of strength she had while Lily screamed at the thing outside to stop, to leave them alone, to go away. But the voice just got more desperate, more convincing. Cry about monsters and fog, and please, Daddy, please. And David was stronger than Rachel, was pulling toward the door with mechanical determination, while she dug her heels in and felt her grip slipping. Lily threw herself at her father's legs, wrapping around them and crying real tears that mixed with the fake tears of the voice outside, and something that finally broke through, because David stopped pulling, stopped moving, just stood there shaking while the voice outside shifted from pleading to anger, screaming about how they'd left her to die, how they were terrible people, how she hoped the fog took them all, and then it cut off abruptly and the silence that followed was somehow worse. The night stretched on forever, punctuated by voices and footsteps and things moving the walls. And Lily's calculations showed that if the pattern held, the fog should lift within the next 12 to 18 hours. But she warned them that this was when it would be most dangerous, when it would make its final push to claim them before the cycle ended, and it had to retreat back into mountain to sleep for another 13 to 15 years. And they just had to hold out a little longer, just had to resist a little more, just had to stay human and connected and real while everything around them tried to pull them apart. And as the house groaned and shifted and reality bent itself into shapes it was never meant to hold, Rachel looked at David and Lily and wondered if any of them would actually see the sun rise again. The fifth day arrived without warning, time having lost all meaning in a house that shifted and breathed around them like a living thing. And Rachel woke from a half-sleep she didn't remember falling into to find David and Lily huddled together on the couch staring at nothing with hollow eyes while the house groaned and reformed itself around them. The same hallway leading to 3 different rooms depending on which direction you approached it from, gravity pulling sideways in the kitchen so that water flowed up the walls, the basement stairs spiraling up instead of down into darkness that went on forever without any ceiling to stop it. They'd stopped trying to make sense of what they saw, stopped questioning when they walked past themselves in hallways or heard conversations they'd have tomorrow or saw furniture float and rearrange itself. Because reality had become so flexible and strange that trying to hold on to logic would drive them insane faster than the fog could. David looked at Rachel with eyes that held too much knowledge and asked in a voice that cracked on every word as she thought they were still alive. If maybe they died days ago and this was just their minds trying to process death, constructing an endless nightmare from the fragments of their last moments. And Rachel wanted to reassure him, but couldn't find the words because she'd wondered the same thing during the long night when she'd seen herself sleeping in a chair she wasn't sitting in. Lily was the one who kept them grounded. Her notebook filled with observations and calculations that she reviewed constantly like a lifeline to sanity. And she told in a voice that tried to be confident that according to her tracking of the fog's patterns and the historical records they'd found, the cycle should end soon. The fog should recede within the next few hours if her math was right. But she warned them with tears in her eyes that this was when it would be most dangerous, when it would make its final desperate attempt to claim them before it had to retreat back into the mountain and sleep for another cycle. Rachel forced herself to focus, to be the leader they needed, and she laid out the rules one more time even though they all knew them by heart. Don't listen to the voices no matter what they say. Don't open the doors or windows no matter who's calling. Don't trust what they see or hear. And most importantly, keep talking to each other. Keep touching. Keep verifying that they're all still real and still human and still together. The voices had evolved beyond anything they'd experienced before, no longer just mimicking the dead, but pulling memories directly from their minds like fishing hooks dragging up buried trauma. Rachel's dead sister, calling with stories from their childhood that Rachel had never told anyone, never spoken aloud to a living soul, describing in perfect detail the fort they'd built in the woods behind their house from fallen branches and old blankets, the secret language they'd invented with hand, signals and made-up words, the promise they'd made when Rachel was 12 to always protect each other no matter what, a promise Rachel had broken by not being there when her sister got sick with the cancer that ate her from the inside out over 6 terrible months. David heard his father, who'd abandoned the family when David was 8, apologizing, explaining, begging for forgiveness and a second chance, saying things David had always wanted to hear, but never would because his father had died alone in a motel room 3 states away without ever looking back. Lily heard her mother singing the lullaby she'd supposedly sung during pregnancy, a song Lily had never heard because her mother had died bringing her into the world, but somehow the voice knew the melody and the words and the way she would have sounded, and it was the cruelest thing of all because Lily had no way to verify if it was real or fabricated. The fog began to recede as morning came, or what passed from morning in the distorted timescape they existed in, pulling back from the windows slowly and reluctantly, like it was being forced away against its will. And through the thinning gray they could see the yard, the street, shapes moving in the clearing mist that might have been people. Figures emerged as the fog retreated, walking slowly toward the house in procession that looked almost ceremonial, and Rachel recognized faces from town. Neighbors she'd seen shopping at the market just a week ago, the woman who ran the coffee shop and always remembered her order, the mechanic who'd fixed her car and refused to overcharge her, all of them moving with synchronized steps like a chorus line or military formation, calling out that it was safe now. The fog was lifting. Come outside and help them search for survivors, their voices blending together in perfect harmony that no group of scared, tired people could possibly achieve. David moved toward the window to get a better look, and Lily grabbed his arm, her voice sharp with fear, as she pointed out what Rachel was already seeing. They were moving in perfect unison, every step matched, every gesture identical, heads turning at exactly the same angle at exactly the same moment. And that wasn't possible. No group of real people moved like that. They had to be puppets or copies or something worse. More figures appeared as the fog thinned, dozens of them now, and Rachel saw James Kovac and Pastor Jerome and Tom Whitmore and even Sara, all of them young and healthy and calling for help. And the synchronization became more obvious. all their mouths moving in exactly the same pattern, all their hands gesturing identically, like one mind controlling multiple bodies. They approached the house slowly, steadily, calling out reassurances and pleas for help, and Rachel felt the terrible pull of moral obligation warring with survival instinct, because what if even one of them was real? What if there was an actual person out there who needed help, and they were condemning them to death by staying inside? David wanted to go, wanted to help, his hand on the door handle again, saying they couldn't just abandon people who might be real survivors. But Lily was adamant, pointing at her notebook where she calculated the exact timing of the cycle end, saying this was the final test, the last trick, and they had to wait just a little longer. The figure stopped exactly at the property line, an invisible barrier they couldn't cross, and they stood there in their synchronized formation, calling and waving and pleading, and Rachel made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. They would wait. They would not open the door. They would not risk it even if it meant real people died outside while they hid inside. The figure stood at the property line for hours that felt like days, their voices never stopping, never showing fatigue. And gradually Rachel noticed they were fading, becoming translucent like Sara had been, and one by one they dissolved back into the retreating fog, until there was nothing left but empty street and the gray mist pulling away toward the mountain. They waited another hour in absolute silence, watching the fog recede completely, watching real sunlight break through real clouds for the first time in 5 days. And when Rachel finally opened the door, the air that rushed in was clean and cold and smelled of pine instead of decay. Pinewood Ridge was empty, completely deserted like a ghost town from the Old West. Doors hanging open on houses, revealing living rooms with coffee cups still on tables and televisions frozen on the last channel anyone had watched. Cars abandoned in the middle of the street with keys still in ignitions, and doors left open like people had simply stepped out and vanished mid-step. The church standing silent with its bell frozen mid-swing exactly where it stopped on that first day, and as they walked through town calling out for survivors, for anyone who might have hidden like they had. Their voices echoed back from empty buildings with no one to answer, no sound but the wind moving through abandoned streets. They searched systematically, checking every house and business, looking in basements and attics and closets, calling out constantly, and found nothing but empty rooms and the eerie sense of lives interrupted mid-moment, until they heard crying from the hardware store basement, a sound so human and frightened that they ran toward it. And there they found a boy maybe 8 years old hiding in a supply closet behind boxes of nails and bags of concrete, filthy and terrified and dehydrated, and clutching a note his mother had written in shaking handwriting telling him to hide and be quiet no matter what he heard, no matter who called his name, no matter if it sounded like her or his father or his teacher, to stay hidden and count at 10,000 over and over until the fog was completely gone and the sun came back. The boy said his name was Michael, and he'd been down here for 5 days counting minutes on his fingers because he didn't have a watch, keeping track of time by making marks on the wall with a nail, and his mother had locked him in from the outside and told him she loved him more than anything in the world. And then he'd heard her screaming outside, and after that just silence, days and days of terrible silence. And Rachel's heart broke as she lied to him and said his mother might have evacuated, with others might still be alive somewhere safe. Even though they all knew the truth, they walked toward the highway. The four of them, Rachel and David and Lily and Michael, carrying nothing but Lily's notebook and the knowledge of what they'd survived. And when they reached the edge of town where cell service returned their phones powered on simultaneously and exploded with notifications, hundreds of messages from friends and family, and news alerts about the unusual storm system that had isolated a small mountain town for several days. Rachel looked back at Pinewood Ridge one last time and saw the fog, still clinging to the mountain peak, swirling in patterns that might have been random or might have been watching them leave. And she knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't over, just dormant, waiting for the next cycle. Lily asked the question they were all thinking, "Is it over?" And David answered with the only truth he could offer, "Until next time." Rachel added, trying to convince herself as much as the others. We survived. That's what matters. But Michael looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much and asked, will it come back? And Rachel lied again because the truth was too terrible. No, you're safe now. But as they drove away in the first car they found on the highway with a working engine, as emergency services and news crews started arriving to investigate the mysterious communication blackout, as they tried to explain what had happened and saw the disbelief in official eyes, Rachel watched the mountain in the rear-view mirror and saw the fog never fully left the peak, saw it swirling around something ancient and patient and hungry, and she understood finally that there are places humans shouldn't be, boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, and Pinewood Ridge had been built on one of them, and every 13 to 15 years the mountain woke up to remind people of their mistake, and nothing they could do would stop it, nothing would destroy it. They could only survive it and carry the knowledge forward and hope that next time there would be survivors too, and the fog would claim fewer people, and maybe, just maybe, someone would finally be smart enough to abandon the town forever and let the mountain have its forbidden ground back.